Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2019 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Philip Tu, and I'm a second-year MBA at MIT Sloan, and it is my pleasure to introduce our panel today, Achievement Unlocked, Esports Analytics. Today, our panelists are Sebastian Park, Vice President of Esports at Clutch Gaming and Houston Rockets, Doug Watson, Head of Esports Insights at Riot Games, Nicole Pike, Global Managing Director at Nielsen Esports, Kazar Jafruti, Senior Business Analyst of Strategy and Analytics at Activision Blizzard, Ed Chang, Director of Business Strategy at Electronic Arts, and our panel will be moderated by Ryan Garvat, Senior Editor of Esports at ESPN. The panel will run for 45 minutes, with 10 minutes additionally for questions. If you would like to submit questions, please do so via Twitter with our hashtag #EsportsAnalytics. With that, I'll hand it over to Ryan.
Great, thank you. I've got a mic here, thanks. Welcome, thanks again for everybody braving the weather to come here. It's a nice crowd too. We'll get right into it. I'm gonna set it up a little bit about the state of the industry and to see how we can fix it. The esports industry brought in $865.1 million of revenue in 2018, according to a Newzoo report released a couple weeks ago. And Newzoo says that the industry stands to reach $1.1 billion this year, and based on the company's projections, and with a growth rate of 22.3% year over year. Newzoo predicted that the industry will rake in $1.79 billion in revenue by 2022. These are big numbers. And earlier I saw a conversation yesterday on Twitter how Riot's self-reported League of Legends World Championships viewership compared to the Super Bowl. And there was a debate about the viability of that number. These are large numbers. These are big attention-grabbing numbers. So I'll start with Sebastian. What's the problem with that?
I mean, so when we first came to Sloan for esports here like a few years ago, even 2015, the main intent was evangelism, right? Esports was not readily known by the community at large. Society hadn't picked up the Fortnite craze, hadn't found out about Overwatch and League of Legends and Apex. What ends up happening is like back then, the goal was to get attention-grabbing numbers, to tell the world that, hey, we're a real thing, pay attention to us. The problem is that there are some like serious downstream effects that really hurt the industry if we keep pushing numbers that aren't necessarily true or valid, right? It's beneficial for organizations, both on the sponsorship front, but also on the team front to say, hey, we're destroying the Super Bowl, we're destroying the World Series in terms of viewership. And that creates an expectation that may not hold up if when we go back and drill down to the numbers, we're not comparing the right things to each other. And that, I think, is something that we're starting to see now because unlike in traditional sports where you have companies like Nielsen reporting on what they're trying to do, in our industry, the reporting numbers generally come from the publishers themselves or from teams or from organizations who are self-interested. And those incentives may cause issues.
Yeah, it really is that structural issue where, traditional sports, the NBA and the NFL are not responsible for telling everyone how many people watch it. You have companies like Nielsen. Without that in esports, every company is kind of using their own metrics, and it's really the Wild West in a way.
Yeah. And we run into an issue then of accountability and consistency. When we don't have essentially third parties that are able to tell this story on behalf of, again, the leagues and the teams and the publishers, you run into a spot where anybody can put any numbers out there. And there's no set standard and consistency within them. So you start making those comparisons, and when you drill into it, they're not the same thing.
Yeah. But you guys are working to fix that. And Nicole, I know at Nielsen, accuracy of reporting is core to the central to your organization, and you want to be that third party to help. Can you tell me a little bit about what you guys are doing at Nielsen to kind of become that kind of intermediary voice in this industry?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was really the cornerstone of why Nielsen felt it was important for us to develop a practice area that was esports specific. Even outside research firms that are putting numbers out, a lot of them come from gaming specific research and aren't evaluating all the other forms of entertainment and viewership out there, so there's an inherent opportunity for that to become biased for self-fulfilling reasons. So we basically want to be and can be the Switzerland in all this. Certainly it's not as easy as TV, where right now, obviously Nielsen is the one measuring all that, and you flip it on, if there's a new program on, Nielsen measures. So we've kind of taken two sides. One is working with folks here and others in the industry to just better inform, okay, if viewership is being reported, here's how to put it in a way that is comparative between traditional sport or other form of entertainment. And then the second step of that is actually Nielsen coming into the space and being able to measure, working with the broadcasters to be the third party that's actually doing it, not just controlling and advising on what the metrics should be.
And how have you worked with Activision Blizzard and Riot so far? And is there anything you can share about where you're at in that relationship, and something we can look forward to?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure they can comment
Doug,
as well.
if you want to chime in.
Yeah,
Yeah, so the folks on stage here have all recognized that this is an issue, that if we're not the ones that are going to steward a movement towards consistency in reporting and actually gain trust of those entering the space, then what we're really doing is building castles in the sky, right? We're going to build things that are not sustainable and not consistent long term. And so for us, we've been focused on saying, how can we help the industry understand the space better? And how can we provide those standard definitions and build those things out with new forms of education that everyone can get behind and be consistent behind, so that over time we have numbers that are comparable, the numbers that can be related back to traditional media marketing, and make it so that folks entering the space have the ability to come in with like eyes wide open. And so the folks up here have identified that this is something where it's our responsibility in order to help make sure esports gets to where it should be, and put that behind it.
Yeah, I think the other piece here is that esports is probably one of the first sports that is like digital first, like before linear. But now we are also putting our content, a lot of us are putting our content on linear also.
Yeah.
And so how do we make an apples to apples comparison, right, of viewership when we're going out and selling sponsorships, or we're going out and comparing metrics? And I think while digital first, we see a lot of linear platforms also going digital, so it's like a hybrid. And the sooner we get ahead of that curve and we're able to standardize the way we report, I think the better aligned that we all are.
Yeah, I think,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it seems like everyone is looking at esports and saying it's blowing up so fast, and everyone loves the narrative that esports is bigger than X. So any company that comes out and puts any big number out, they get quoted by essentially everyone, and they're incentivized to do that.
Oh yeah.
So like we have to kind of fight that and try to make sure that there's the right numbers, everything is real. At the same time, everyone really wants to go out and say the biggest numbers possible, because if you're the biggest number, you get quoted the most.
I mean, it's fascinating to hear for me to hear you say we want to have a more realistic number, because so much of the momentum of the esports industry has been throwing these large figures out there. I guess I'll throw this to Sebastian. How would you combat misinformation? How do you identify what may be a suspicious number or something like that, and then what would be your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really important, right, is that when you often run into these numbers, they're impressive because they're supposed to be impressive, right? And so the first thing you have to think about is, what is the actual total addressable market of esports? And the honest answer is that esports is massive. Like, there are hundreds of millions of people in the world who will watch, but they're in the world. They're not just in Los Angeles or New York. There aren't 100 million people in Los Angeles. Like, there might be in Shanghai, but definitely not in LA. And so you start with there, and I think part of it is just double checking those numbers. And I don't want to throw anyone under the bus here, but when I read a lot of these papers, especially like the Newzoo paper, great headline, picked up basically by everyone. I don't know where they derived 50% of those numbers, right? Like, how are you separating one thing from the other? And it's just just thinking critically, right? I think everyone on this stage, like, we represent 3 different game publishers. I think the 3 largest game publishers in the United States, Nielsen obviously, even ESPN to a certain extent. These companies are coming to the space and looking at the numbers that we have. And from an observer's perspective, you just have to think a little bit more cynically. To be like, hey, like, it's awesome to accept this at face value, but let's take a step back. and examine how it actually works. And I think that's, for the longest time, especially because so many organizations are venture-backed or they're built on this hype, you sometimes turn a blind eye to it and no one calls the emperor naked, right? And so I think it's reassuring that being critical of the space is something that's shared across different game publishers and different people. Like that's the easiest way to really drive this for change.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point in terms of it's important to look at kind of the motivations of the reporting of the data, right? I think we are all up here because we hope that 20 years from now we're sitting here and talking about esports and how big it is. But there's short-term investors that have come into the space. There's a lot of money that's been poured in, and if someone's looking to hit their rate of return on an investment of a team or something, like they're more incentivized really to report certain numbers that may or may not have holes in it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that transfers over to the brand and sponsorship investment as well. We see a lot of brands who are at one end of the spectrum where they literally won't put $1 in until there's third-party measurement. Others who the conversation has changed even over the past 18 months when brands come to us and talk to us. At first it used to be, so are these numbers real about esports or not? And now the big question is, what's the real number? Because we know this is wrong. So there's starting to be more recognition out there that's going to have more effect long term on whether they're even willing to put dollars in as well.
Yeah. And that's not a good conversation to have, right? Like that's the wrong conversation to be having when you're getting into esports. Like last year, we had sources out there reporting our MSI numbers, our mid-season invitational numbers, were I think like 126 million at peak. And we had to immediately go out there and refute that and be like, no, that's 6.5 times higher than what we actually saw. The number that we saw at peak was great. It was something that we were proud of. Like we went up, I think, 22% year over year, somewhere in that ballpark.
You saw 22 million people watching, right?
Yeah.
It's
meaningful.
22 million people don't just up and watch something, right? And so clearly that's huge.
But let's have that conversation.
Right.
And then let's talk about that audience and who that audience is, because that audience is a demographic that is extremely valuable and is really interesting, hard to reach. And everyone's fighting for their attention. So let's have the conversation about what we can do and bring folks into the space, with the eyes wide open.
Well, you're touching on our next topic is basically kind of measuring what a viewer is. Since Ed mentioned that this is the digital first sport, and people are consuming esports in ways that are foreign to traditional sports or were for a time. For example, a Twitch viewer has a chat going on the right, and they're interacting. When they link their account to their Blizzard account and they're watching Overwatch League, they're earning in-game currencies, essentially like a pay-for-view. They're more of a participant, whereas like a Sunday Night Football viewer may be a passive viewer. How do you compare a Twitch viewer versus like a Sunday Night Football viewer, more passive? And I'll let Ed maybe start with that.
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think the first big difference is really how much more data we have about a digital viewer, right? I think we talk a lot about esports analytics and things that we wish were better, but I said this yesterday, like, what analytics do you get on a billboard in an arena, right? Or on the side of the freeway, which people are paying money for since the beginning of advertising, really. And so we just have so much more data on a user. We know where they're from. We sometimes know their age group. You mentioned things like the Twitch linking. So we do this. I think Overwatch does this, and CSGO do this. But on Twitch, people are able to connect their account with the publisher, and they can earn prizes and in-game items by viewing the stream. We call it's Twitch drops, right? And when they link their accounts, we basically get so much data into their gameplay behavior, and we link that with their viewing behavior. And I think one of the biggest questions that we as publishers are always trying to answer is, what is the efficacy of what we're doing, right? Like in terms of, is esports really moving the needles at the tip of the spear? And we're able to look at that kind of data and say, conclusively, like, yes, when someone watches one of our FIFA broadcasts, they spend more time in the game, they spend more money in the game, and that's really powerful. Versus linear, you have service like Nielsen do a great job, but it's somewhat of a black box to get to know anything more about purchasing behavior or things like that.
You mentioned something that struck me, and I'll ask Nicole this. You said that through a Twitch viewer, through a digital viewer, you can collect a lot more information. But Nielsen has been working for forever to collect information on linear viewers. how wide is that gap of information, or is that true? And how do you account for that in a standardization metric?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of two sides to this. So one is the who are they and how and why are they valuable side of things, and the other side is just like, are they a viewer or not? Do we even count them as that? And I think, to Ed's point, there's a ton of data that publishers can have and can kind of prove out the longer tail value of someone. I think where the industry is still at in terms of being able to have alignment and trusted information is how many of those persons are there actually, and what can we realistically count? I mean, and that's what this group has talked a lot about in terms of what's the right metric. If you're talking about reach, is it anyone that happens to go upon a Twitch broadcast for 3 seconds, or is it someone that's watched for 6 minutes? Like there's those sorts of things where that's where a company like Nielsen coming in and number one, setting a standard for how to define, and then actually setting everything up to be able to measure that, so it's not on the onus of everyone on the stage or the broadcasters to have to figure that out themselves, where there's that value, and then from there you can take whatever that number yields and add on all the great stuff about why those are the right persons to be reaching.
Yeah, and from the publisher perspective, all that data collection, it serves two purposes. Part of it is to enable the sport to do better and to have the actual right partners come into the sport and understand what they're doing, understand what the performance is, understand the audience. The other side of it is upstream at the game level itself. How can we use that data to inform the game and improve the play experience for that same fan at home? So for us, we need to think of what data can we get and how do we apply it to the right product surface. And then within the sports space, how can we make sure that data becomes available to the right partners so that they can make the right decisions and that we can have the appropriate conversation about how they can bring an authentic message to that audience and have a great experience for the fan.
And just interject, I think one thing that's worth drilling down on here is that you shouldn't take away from this that people are bearish about esports, right? That's not the concern here. The concern here is that the conversation should be, hey, who are the most valuable demographics to capture if you are a sports advertiser or an advertiser in general? And it's almost always 18 to 25-year-old men and like 25-year-old to 35-year-old women, right? And both categories are playing and watching and consuming this content. The conversation shouldn't be, do I get the entire country of the United States to watch? Which is what the Super Bowl analogy usually is. Like that's just a different value add. The amazing thing about a League of Legends broadcast is that you can watch Clutch Gaming play, and then you can watch 4 other games back to back to back to back, right? You can go and watch a Counter-Strike event, same thing. You can just watch for 10 hours straight. And even without necessarily the deepest YouTube or RTB type of data around the person, I can tell you, like, look, we can look in the audience and say, no one here is over 30, right? And so, I'm not this audience, I think you guys have some people here, but like in an esports audience, like most people aren't over 30. And so that immediately, it doesn't matter if that number is 100 million or 20 million, both numbers are far more people that they're getting access to than even the NBA, right? And that I think is something that it makes people, like people don't want to talk about it because they think it's going to hurt their positioning, but in reality, no, it's going to help because later on, and beyond the 6-12 month period that we're thinking about, we're going to start seeing the improvements of the type of targeting you're doing. Your ads, your sponsorships, your partnerships are going to look better if you're targeting the right people with them.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think in sports, not that many people look publicly at the 18 to 34 demographic versus, the P2 plus or the 18 to 49, and this is something I know we've looked at, and there's a pretty big drop-off as you get into 18 to 34, where it could be like 10% of the whole audience. And I think that's where esports can actually compete today with that audience, in the US even.
Yeah, agree. And I think, unfortunately, some of the big numbers that people don't trust then create distrust in that underlying story that should be told and should be the undercurrent of why this is a valuable industry. If you start at the top and lose people there, they're not going to keep listening.
Kazri, Activision Blizzard, maybe of any of the major esport developers, have been attracted to linear television with a broadcast on Disney XD and ESPN. I have written down here digital versus linear, but is it? I mean, how do you treat the different platforms? And I know one of the goals is to simplify that question, but is it really digital? Is it really are you looking at different platforms in different ways?
Yeah, and I think a platform at the end of the day is extension of the audience. So I think when we look at linear and we look at digital, it's a way to reach even more people. And at the end of the day, linear has really, really high reach. You look at their average audience numbers and it's really high, even at a basic level. So I think as we look at the platforms we put our content on, it's to ensure that as many people as possible can see it.
Yeah. The thing I think is important here is we want to reach people wherever they want to watch. At the end of the day, if I'm watching on a mobile phone, if I'm watching on my TV, if I'm watching on a computer while I'm playing the game, it doesn't matter. It's where am I having the experience and what content am I consuming. And we want to make sure when we talk about measurement perspective that we're measuring all of that in a consistent way and that it's apples to apples with any other types of opportunities to be able to reach that same type of audience. After that, what's the beautiful thing about esports is that you have an audience who has these connection points with the game and with the space in a different way, be it through Twitch, be it through the gameplay itself. And it unlocks other opportunities to bring great messaging to that audience. And so when we think about the measurement perspective, we want the measurement for the viewership to align with the way that you think about how you measure viewership traditionally and simplify the conversation. And then after that, we can go a bit further and saying, how can we use that other space and those other forms of messaging and, again, measure those appropriately, but use those things to bring other forms of engagement and again, the full story together for a brand.
Yeah, I mean, look, if it wasn't for, if ESPN's not paying us a lot of money, like, and by us, I'm saying League of Legends in this case. You guys are paying other people lots of money. If ESPN's paying a lot of money, that is the only reason to content gate, right? If you're not content gating, just be everywhere, right? Like, there's no reason for you to be on one platform. You want the maximal exposure. That's sort of the entire intent. And then you go to ESPN and say, hey guys, so 10 years, $30 billion for esports, sound good? And then you move on with your life, right? Like, I think without that ability to like reach that broader audience, I think that's just a different conversation, right? It makes no sense. I hear people all the time being like, oh, why are people on linear? And I'm like, well, why shouldn't they be? If they're going to have them, put it on there. And if it works out, great. If it doesn't work out, we'll learn something new. Yeah. The concern I think that you brought up, and I think Ed brought up earlier was backstage, was that when you go on linear, you don't want to then therefore judge the linear broadcast on E-League on Turner against how the Celtics played last night, right? How that game is doing. That's going to be a really painful comparison for esports, and it's not the correct one, right? Like it's that I think is the only concern we have when we're on all these platforms is because these numbers are so poorly reported. If you are on YouTube and Twitch and Caffeine and Facebook and linear, somehow people get lost and can't report an accurate number anymore.
Yeah. I think for us to beyond the numbers, I think there's a difference in how we treat the broadcast on both linear and digital. I think it's safe to say that out of the games on stage, ours are probably the easiest to understand. It's not a reach, right? It's like Madden, it's FIFA, even Apex. But I think we treat the broadcast differently because they serve different methods, right? Like we talked about how big linear still is. Like everyone sees the cord cutting numbers, but still linear is massive. And so it's like drinking from the fire hose. It's just like, bam. Like if you want an interesting time, whenever Overwatch or League or even Madden is on linear TV, look on Twitter and people are either really happy or really angry, have no idea why it's on their TV screen, replacing whatever their favorite show is. But it's a chance to expose, for better or worse, to an audience that normally never would have watched some of our content. And I think when we put it on digital, that's like the core, that's like the authentic broadcast. It's for the hardcore players. It's people that are going to tune in every single day, and right after they watch, they're going to try this newest tactic they saw in League or Overwatch in the server. So we treat those broadcasts differently because they're really for different audiences, I think.
Yeah. How do you treat that, Brian? How do you treat that differently? What's a comparison between your strategy doing a Madden broadcast versus, say, let's say a MOBA style broadcast? I mean, you're differentiating between games. What do you mean?
No, I think it's the way you present the content. So I think League does a really good job actually, where I know it's League or Dota, where you guys have a beginner stream, really, where it's like, oh, I'm going to explain this in layman's terms because you may not understand.
That's my favorite stream, by the way.
Yeah, it's mine too. But when you're watching on digital, the assumption, I think, is that you are a level 10, at least, in League of Legends, and you actually care a lot more about this content, and you understand it better. So they can maybe go a little more in depth, right? And I think, again, going back to linear versus digital, different sponsors might have different goals. Like if you're a HyperX, do you want to reach that hardcore League of Legends fan? versus if you are, a blockbuster movie that's coming out, do you want to be on linear with a wider range of reach?
It's so funny because that's the opposite experience of traditional sports, right? I still can't figure out what icing is. Like people keep telling me what icing is, but like if you watch CBS or NBC and they have hockey on, they're not going to explain icing to you. You have to go on Reddit or go over to someone who watches hockey. So you have to go to Canada, and then you would have to consume this type of content that way, right? Like it's just really hard. And I think same thing for American football. And I wonder this, and Ed, I think you're a particularly interesting person to ask this question to. Is like, what do you do when you have, like in American football, no one knows what, people can't name what offensive holding is, right? Like they just don't truly understand the concept. Is it just a matter of time? Like, do we just let people, we already capture such a large percentage of the 18 to 34-year-old demographic. In 20 years, they'll be 38 to 54, right? So that's math.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a philosophical question because I think the ground rules you're comparing are a little different because I think I could take someone who is a hardcore gamer, doesn't care about sports, and we could take them to the Celtics game last night, and if they've never seen basketball before, by the second quarter, they probably figure out what's going on. Like, you got to put the ball in the hoop. I've watched probably 1,000 hours of League, and I couldn't tell you, really what's going on still, right? It's just, it's confusing, and I know when people are cheering or the casters are screaming, and over time when I've started playing, it's like you get to know it a little bit, but then there's that question of, our addressable audience, is that only ever going to be people who play the game, or is it more? And I think with League and Overwatch, you start to see in FIFA, people are actually going to the games because they care about the personalities and the storylines. It's a matter of fleshing that out. And I think we need to do a better job of storytelling. We were talking about backstage. And then I think there's also things around the broadcast you can do. So, we work on this thing we call interactive broadcasts. So things like Twitch extensions and drops where, is there a way for us to surface relevant information into the broadcast? Because it can be really confusing if you just join the middle of an Overwatch League broadcast today and not really know what's going on. But if you can surface contextual information and stats that kind of paint that narrative, I think we're slowly getting there. But there's so many things that we're working on at one time that it's hard to just fully invest in one thing.
Yeah, even from a storytelling perspective, when we were on ESPN last year for our finals, ESPN had a desk, and they actually spent a lot of time explaining what the game was and making sure people that are tuning in that have never played can understand it. And even when you're showing the game, Overwatch is a pretty hectic game, and if you look at it in first-person point of view and that keeps changing, it's confusing. So when we're on linear, we try to, show a little bit more third-person, something that people can understand. They can kind of see their characters moving not from the first-person point of view. And we think that helps a lot, too.
I think it's something you touched on, Ed, is that if we think about it, esports is still really in its infancy when we compare it to traditional sports. And at Riot, our goal is to create a multi-generational sport. We want folks who are continually coming back to the game and having a relationship to the game, be it by play or watch, but also to bring their kids. And we're just starting to see that now. And if we think of traditional sports and the relationship people have to it, it's typically they grow up playing it. They end up having it as a favorite team. They get into fandom. They may continue playing it the rest of their lives, but at some point, a lot of folks stop playing. And so they have a relationship to the sport itself that they then carry over into their viewing experience. And in the esports world, that's just starting to happen. And so when we're thinking about what is the level of education that's necessary to get the audience in, it's just starting now. But over time, what we'll end up seeing is that those folks will start bringing in their families, and that when their kids start to play, they'll also be able to have that experience with them and have a different type of bonding moment over the actual game itself. And that basic understanding, which is necessary in the storytelling now, will evolve.
Even in my side of the world, we struggle, we talk about that all the time. At what point, how much do you explain? What's the audience? At some point, we all believe that we'll have to take the kid gloves off, but the example that I always use is, you don't see people explaining in regular stories what a post pattern is in a football game. But then if you don't explain enough, you'll lose an audience that isn't already familiar with you. Yeah. But you mentioned enhancing the viewing experience. This question is for Nicole. We now know that we need a standardization metric. We need third parties. That helps advertisers and everything. But are you using analytics to help and enhance the viewer experience or plans to? And if so, how would you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Nielsen in the traditional sport and kind of broader entertainment space. We acquired a company called Grace Note, who has a lot of kind of the metadata around statistics and information that ends up being overlaid on things. They're across music, everything like that. So I know that's something that we've looked at kind of moving them in a bigger way into starting to gather that for esports events, and then seeing probably first on the linear side, just because these guys all have it already for digital, right? So it's easier from a Nielsen perspective to kind of start there and see how you can kind of have that, side by side on smart TVs where you have things rolling while a game is going on and that sort of thing. So I definitely think there's opportunity for that in the future.
Kaz, we talked a lot about Overwatch and how Overwatch is a great game to play. It has a really enthusiastic fan base. We were talking about the Shanghai Dragons today. But fundamentally, the game is difficult to watch. How are you guys using analytics and data to figure out the best way to simplify what can be a really difficult game?
Yep, I think we're always trying to tell stories through data so that people can understand what they're watching and even understand why a player may be good and why a player may not be good. Last year we introduced the overhead cam to show the player positions, and I think that helped a lot of people understand, positioning. And as well, one of the things we're trying to figure out is how do you, through data, tell the story about a player being good? Because in a game like basketball, shot percentage is like a pretty good metric, and it actually says how many times you make a shot. But you look at a game like Overwatch, where it's not necessarily about how many people you kill or there's a team fight, do you come out on top. There's other things, just positioning, like hiding behind the wall, making sure you don't die, and trying to figure out how do you tell that story through data. And it's actually really, really challenging because we have too much data. We actually have every little bit of data there is. It would be like if the NBA knew in basketball how many rotations the ball took between every pass. So going through all that and trying to figure out what actually makes sense and what is the right story to tell.
I think there's the piece also Doug mentioned earlier about kind of bringing the content to the viewer. And one of my favorite segments on like Sports Centers, when they do like sports science, right? It's like LeBron could run through a brick wall or something, right? And they talk about why that happens. And I think it's how do we tell that in esports? Because it's a very cerebral game, right? It's like APM in StarCraft, like actions per minute. Like no one understands what that is. Like the higher the better, okay. And if you're Korean, it's insane,
mine's
right?
very low.
Mine too. But I think there's ways to kind of go beyond that. Like I think I saw an E-League tweet when they did like a fighting game thing, and they were saying that they tested them for like their reflexes, and they actually said that the fighting game players were actually as good as any athlete in terms of reaction time, aside from, you'll like this, Doug, hockey goalies actually. But like that kind of stuff was just fascinating because I would never have expected that. And so being able to tell that story through the data, right? And it's a matter of, I think, focus of being able to devote your cycles to telling what's important. I think that would be really cool.
We live in a great world on the esports side due to the wealth of data that we have, because we have both the information coming out of the game itself that we can integrate back into the storytelling in order to build these really rich experiences and understanding like who did what, how did they do it, and why was that the most amazing play that you see. The other side of it, though, is with these types of integrations like we mentioned before with Twitch and platforms in the game itself, we end up having information about the audience, and while we can focus on bringing the content to them where they want to watch it, we can also bring the right content to them. And we can start focusing on how do you tailor that information in order to make it so that they understand the game better as it relates to the way that they want to play, or that it updates like the way that they view the entertainment experience overall. It's one of the beautiful things about esports in that digital world, and I think we're just starting to see some of that application come to life.
Well, I may ask you to expand on that a little bit, because what Kazra was saying, Overwatch and League of Legends are very different games. Yeah. And Kazra mentioned the overhead cam and from the beginning of Overwatch and the viewing experience and spectators till now, that experience has changed a lot. From the way the colors are, even the percentage of using overhead cams and third-party cams. However, League of Legends in that viewing experience has changed very little. But you're still collecting data and you're trying to benefit it. So how are you using that data that you collect in order to change a broadcast or a viewing experience of something that people are used to for a long time that hasn't really had a significant change in as long as I've been watching?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so first of all, my team works with this space. Like the way that we view ourselves is we are the voice of the fan. We are there to understand what they're viewing, what their needs are, and turn that into the best product that we can. And that is within the broadcast. And we keep certain things consistent within the broadcast because those are ways that the audience understands the game itself and that it's the easiest way for them to relate back to the game. So League of Legends is played with like a third-person point of view over the map. There's not really a reason to change that. What we can do, though, is we can think of when we go to highlights, like how can we go into a highlight reel and show a different view of that is interesting, exciting, and helps them engage with the entertainment aspect. Or we can look outside of the broadcast itself, and we can say, what type of additional shoulder content can we create that gives them that value? So when we create a series like The Dive, or if we go into a breakdown segment, we can go in and provide educational context to that player that wants to go deeper based off of, again, that feedback that we receive, that's something that they're really interested in. And we can really hone those experiences for them on top of the game itself while making the game still consistent.
Wait, so Doug, since you guys kicked Jad off and brought in Captain Flowers into the show, do you guys have pretty good data about like how many older TSM fans you've lost and how many Clutch Gaming fans you've gained? Like, is that the type of granularity you have in there?
I think we get at least one Clutch Gaming fan.
Only one.
Just one that I've seen in the data so far.
It's super interesting, right? Because if you guys can manipulate, like manipulate might not be the right word, but like if you guys can manipulate viewer behavior based on how you guys are observing them, that's incredibly powerful, right? Like that would be like changing the games to make people watch it more. That's glad you guys are working on that. As someone in your league, I'm very happy about that. So.
Yeah, it's again, our focus is to make the best experience for the player at home. And for that fan that's watching the game, we want to continually to evolve the product space so that they're entertained, that they want to come back, that they want to ask for more content, and that they have a great experience when they spend time with us. Because if they have a great experience with us, that means everyone else that we bring into the space, everyone that we invest into the ecosystem with, has a authentic and great relationship with that fan as well. And there's trust there. And so we want to continue to evolve that as much as we can and do that through data.
Hey, Ryan, real quickly, I know you're the moderator, but I just want to ask you a question.
You're doing great, Sebastian.
Hey, so how do you compare, how does ESPN compare these three games against each other? And then probably a Nielsen question as well. Like, your game lasts almost exactly an hour. Your FIFA Madden games are pretty like set forth, but like your Apex game can last really long or really short, right? Like if there's a lot more.
Really long.
Really long. and then like Overwatch has a map point system that really confuses me still. So like how do those three things measure up against each other? How does that work?
I guess I'll do the moderator thing and answer and send this to Nicole. Like, how do you compare games versus games and whatever Sebastian asked me.
I mean, I think you have to, and you talk about these three games, but then you can expand that to, okay, IEM Katowice is going on, and that's a weekend-long event where
There's about
you're
500,000
reaching
people watching
a ton
right
of
now, I
different
think,
people, multiple games, all that. And so when you think about it in that way, like, we've talked about standardizing metrics, but there does have to be multiple types of metrics that you can look at to make sure you're understanding all aspects. So you can look at the average viewer across the course of a particular broadcast, which will equalize the length of your match versus your match versus your match versus Katowice. But it's probably going to be a lot different, or you could tell a really different story if you look at how many people were reached across the course of an entire broadcast, which is also valuable. And if you're measuring it in the right way across all of them, can tell a different story. So Katowice over a weekend may reach a lot more people because there's just that much more content to be able to consume. So I think it's just identifying, having all metrics for all different format and game types, and then allowing people to tell the right story for their particular property using those.
And this is can kind of go with Kazra and Ed too. I'll start with Ed. That you publish sports titles, and now you've recently launched Apex Legends. How do you compare your different titles, and are the audiences as segmented as I assume they are, or do you see a lot of overlap into how they're playing your suite of games or watching your suite of games? Excuse me.
Yeah, I think for the competitive gaming division, we kind of look at our objectives in two different ways, and I think one is we call it player engagement. So based off what we're doing in terms of producing content and putting on competitive programs and features in the game, do we change player behavior? And we've shown that we can. Players that are involved in competition at EA, whether it's viewing or it's competing, they spend a lot more time in the game and they spend more money in the game, right? The second piece is when we look at kind of we call out of game revenue. So it's sponsorship, media rights, things that you guys are focusing on right now with your franchise leagues and all that. And we're working on that. And I think when you compare across the games, you have to figure out, when you're comparing with other publishers, we don't know their player data, but we know what their numbers look like and we can compare on that basis. And then I think when we look at our games, it really depends on the specific genre and the audience type. And we have a data team that they're responsible for kind of crunching those numbers and seeing where there's cannibalization and things like that. But really, when we look at other publishers, we look at that viewership angle, like things like viewable hours, AMA, that we've been talking for months about. Yeah.
Yeah, but we
Do you see cross-pollination?
We definitely do, and it's not, the overlap isn't as much as people think. You know, like I'll use Call of Duty and Overwatch as an example. The overlap is probably like 5%. It's actually two different audiences, so it's in our benefit to grow both. And anytime new games come out and people see a game get really popular, the whole pie is growing, and I think it adds viewers to everyone's pool. It's not necessarily people are jumping between any of these games.
It's not a zero-sum game. I think people assume like, oh, Fortnite's the king now and they have all the viewers. It's like, actually, Fortnite has probably brought in a ton of new viewers onto Twitch, and hopefully Apex has also, and Overwatch and League, and that people have different moods. Sometimes I want to watch NBA, sometimes I want to watch football, and there's just something for everybody, and that's kind of how we see our games too.
And I think that's a dynamic of the Twitch platform as well, where it's, right now, pretty much any content related to esport can all be in one place, and it's really easy to kind of experiment and flip back and forth between. I think it'll be interesting to see in 5 years, depending on where the broadcast landscape is, if that becomes easier or more difficult for people to so fluidly go across.
Yeah.
And you can actually even see it like on Sundays, for example. I think all three of our games have leagues on every Sunday, and the viewership is still the same. It's not like it's going down.
Yeah.
There's just more people tuning in on Sundays.
That's the two arguments I made is that means that there's room for everybody to play. There's a large interest and a large audience. And also, I think it also underscores some of the segmentation, though, that you do have between games by games. I think that MOBA fans are MOBA fans, and FPS fans are FPS fans, and the fighting game community is robust and great. I'm not quite sure how much overlap there is, and maybe one day we'll get to that place where we can figure that out. We have a few viewer questions, and I guess I could start with Kazra actually, because Overwatch is a more general question. But when Activision Blizzard has multiple esports titles, from the OG StarCraft to now to Overwatch. As a gaming company, how do you determine which are the best esports to invest in, or did you just say Overwatch this is it? We believe in this model.
I think a lot of it has to do with looking at the potential in the future of it, and the potential for the game, because you can't just make an esport that lasts for 1 or 2 years. You look at League, for example; it's been around for years and years, and it's trying to identify which games can be around for that much longer.
Same for you, Ed. I mean, you guys you have a suite of multiple titles, and do you differentiate between maybe like a FIFA ecosystem and a Madden ecosystem, and say this is where we want our priority to be?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we're very impressed with what Blizzard has done with Overwatch League, of kind of going out there before officially or really knowing what the market looks like in terms of viewership, and they've done really well so far with that, so that's great. The way that we've taken the approach for the competitive gaming division is starting kind of more of the grassroots perspective of, our slogan is we want to make stars of all the players. Like, we want that narrative of someone on their couch at home playing FIFA sees that, oh, I can qualify for the weekend league and I can actually make it to the FUT Champions Cup in Singapore and become the champion. And I think we're one of the only games up here that still has that ability to do that. I think we get the question a lot of, hey, what's your response to the Overwatch League and LCS? Like, I think a lot of it depends on the success of the game itself, the viewership, how well we do on both the player and the out of game side. But it's an interesting thought and one that we think about too.
Doug had talked about how Riot, you want League of Legends to be a multi-generational esport. It's one of the longest ones that's been around. It's been consistent. How do you do that? I mean, how do you use data to have a long term with so much changing and so much, so many distractions? What's your strategy to keep it going on for the years?
Yeah, I think it comes back to, can we create the experiences that players and fans at home want? And how do we keep doing that? So for us, the data is about gaining that voice of them and understanding what their needs are. Is it, again, why are they coming in to watch to begin with? Are they coming in to learn? Are they coming because it's entertaining? Is it social? Is it because they're a sneaky fan and they just want more sneaky? We want to understand.
We want more
that.
sneaky.
We always want more sneaky. And so for us, what we look to do is continue to listen and continue to modify both the delivery mechanisms, again, like go where they are, and create great content. Because at the end of the day, content is king, and having the content where people want to be is the right place for it. And so we'll continue to evolve those two things over time in order to make the right experiences for our audience. So.
It's kind of tangential to that. Kazra, knowing that League of Legends was the biggest player in the space when Overwatch League was conceptualized and designed, how much did you look at what Riot was doing, and how much did that influence the decisions you made to launch the league the way you did?
I don't know how much of it influenced it, but I think everyone knew that esports needed more structure. And that's something we set out to do. And we also felt that people wanted to support cities, and we wanted to create a city-based structure and allow, just like League did, allow teams to buy a franchise and ensure that they're part of that sport for the years to come as well.
And Sebastian, you had a decision to make about which league to join. You had many options, and you looked at a lot of. How much did data influence your decision to join, to inform the Houston Rockets to join League of Legends rather than anything else?
Yeah, I mean, data was the greatest driver of everything. I mean, we're a very data-driven organization. It starts at the top, then Leslie Alexander, and now Tony Fertitta goes through, Tad Brown, Rafael Stone, Daryl Morey. And so it didn't make the decision that there wasn't just a clear number to look at. And one number said 1 and one number said 10, and so you just picked the 10. It wasn't like that. But there were similar numbers. We use a lot of analysis from international markets, right? So we have a few hypotheses, for example, that South Korea is a pretty good bellwether for game retention rates over long periods of time. We also saw there's a lot of variance, right? There's a person who teaches a class at UT Austin on esports who was messaging me the other day and asking, like, why is it that every year I had to change my Battle Royale slide? I'm like, what do you mean? Well, I started with H1Z1, and then I had to put in PUBG, and then by the time PUBG had a league, like Fortnite became a thing, and by the time I finally figured out what Fortnite was, we have Apex, and I was like, yeah, that's hard, right? That actually does hurt a esport from blossoming correctly, and so we were looking at a lot of those factors, and when you combine that with just like the desire to focus on a specific game, a specific ecosystem, League of Legends really killed at those numbers, up and down, and both in terms of viewership, in terms of lack of churn, in terms of retention. And so we figured, hey, those are the most important metrics to look at, and so that informed our decision. And so it was very data-driven in that sense, although, at the end of the day, like the data confidence intervals were much larger than I would personally be comfortable with generally.
And I think what's interesting, though, going back to that process, is there wasn't just that one number, right? That similar to, like, I think Barack Obama's talk here last year, it's about having good information across the board and having a good system of being able to understand that, get value out of that, and make a good judgment call, right? Because at the end of the day, data is only going to get you so far.
Yeah, and for what's worth, I think people who are trying to project this industry out beyond the next 18 months are crazy. Like if you came to me 18 months ago and told me that in the next 18 months, Fortnite's going to come onto the scene, destroy everything, create a superstar, and then lose 50% of whatever within a 12-month period, I'd be like, what's Fortnite? Or that'd be the question, right? And so that to assume that therefore, like you make decisions in the moment, right? You have to be happy with your process. You have to trust the process, but without losing. Like you have to trust the process, and then you have to go from there and hope that you had the right information. And so I think data collection was probably a large part of it. Data validation was a large part of it, and just a lot of hope and luck.
But I think you made a really good point there. It's about having the right information and good information. And that's, I think, what this group is really here to talk about and get at. Because if we're not the ones that are stewarding good information out there, teams like Clutch would be making bad decisions.
Yeah, no, for sure, right? Because it's if you just have, if you base your financial models off of Newzoo's $1 billion number, I'm like, man, we are not close to $1 billion on the esports side yet.
Getting there. Nicole, you guys actually brought up a really good point where we didn't see Apex Legends coming. I mean, I know you did, but we didn't. And you know.
Did you though?
I knew about it.
Right. You actually even said you weren't really quite sure at what you were surprised by the impact that it immediately had. But how did Nielsen? How are you accounting for new games? I mean, you know, all of a sudden, you know, Apex comes basically out of nowhere and changes the ecosystem that Fortnite had been dominating in a heartbeat. And you know, later this year, who knows what's going to come out that will grab attention again? Yet you're trying to come up with a consistent way of making advertisers attractive to this space. So how do you account for a brand new game coming out, and what do you do about that?
I mean, first of all, we're really candid in the brands that we work with that is going to continue to happen in esports, and no one's going to solve it. And I actually think that's a really good, cool, dynamic thing about esports that you're not going to get in traditional sport, is that there is the opportunity for new things, new titles, new opportunities to come in. And if you're a brand investing, you kind of have the choice of, okay, I'm going to go with the League of Legends that has been really consistent, and that's the path I want to go. Or you have the path of, I love esports, and I may be in a different game a year from now, but I've established myself as connecting with the esport fan, and so I'm comfortable with that varying, you know, from one title to the next or one opportunity to the next. That being said, I mean, of course, we're collecting all sorts of data and trying to look at, you know, through different countries and fan bases and that sort of thing, what, you know, how titles are rising or how titles are falling over time. And then working with brands that we're partnering with to kind of match that up with who their audiences are, what their goals are, and then just kind of trying the best from there. I mean, if these guys don't know that their next title is going to be a big esports hit, then honestly, Nielsen's probably not going to know either. So we have to be a little bit comfortable with not knowing and being really transparent about that.
What are the types of advertisers that are more flexible on new titles? I mean, I'm making an assumption, but would it be like a Honda or a Toyota that might prefer a more stable existing ecosystem, and maybe like a HyperX or a peripheral company being okay with it overall? Is that kind of accurate, or are you trying to help cross-pollinate a little bit of that too?
Yeah, I mean, certainly endemics, any esport is basically going to be relevant to them because whoever's watching it is the audience that they need to sell product to. So that one's kind of like checking the box. They're going to be most comfortable with the ebb and flow over time. When you talk about non-endemics, I have actually found it's more kind of a function of the culture of the brand and who's making the decision within it. You can't categorically say car companies are going to be cool with this, but insurance companies are not. It's really about how they are viewing esports in terms of what they want. Do they want a certain number of impressions every year to check a box, or do they want to create a relationship with the fan? And then just kind of who's leading that charge internally that really has a vision of how they can connect. So it's really more about one-up, as I'm sure you guys, when you work with different partners and try to develop packages and connections, are seeing the same.
The other thing that we've found is that esports is a little different than traditional sports, where traditional sports, you would probably let your kid watch any traditional sport. Like, I want to watch hockey, I want to watch curling, whatever it is. But we've talked to teams who have teams in, for example, Counter-Strike, where the content is a little more, it's terrorist, anti-terrorist, it's bloody, like they're shooting people in the face. Like, some advertisers won't touch that, right? And so games that are more family-friendly tend to have that advantage too, especially if it's a new entrant into the space. Like, we don't want to get our hands dirty with something like this. Let's try it with FIFA or Overwatch or League or something.
League's been great because it seems as though like they just can't. Like, it's an addicting game, and I think that's something that's like less oft talked about, is that video games are very addicting. They're not entirely healthy for everyone, quite frankly. And so what's interesting here is that you see less churn from the more addicting of the game, right? And so I think I saw FIFA was both the first and 10th most sold game on console last month. FIFA 19 being number one, FIFA 18 being number two. And those games aren't that different, with all due respect. And so, like, it's for clear.
Giving away trade secrets up here, Sebastian.
And similarly, like League of Legends, like despite the fact it came out in '09 or whatever, like it was still like #1 or #2 on people just coming back and constantly spending more money and really enjoying it. So that consistency has been really cool, I think, and I think we're gonna start seeing more of it, and that's gonna help.
Yeah, but I think to Nicole's point, when we're talking about the conversations you're having with these brands and these non-endemics are moving into the space, the first part is, okay, are the numbers true? And can I get the right type of return on my investment here, which is something, again, that needs to be handled. And then after that, it's who's the right partner for me to have the type of engagement with the audience that is meaningful, right? And that's where, from a league perspective, we want to have that conversation. We want to focus on that because from each of the different games, you end up with a different type of audience to some degree, and then a different type of footprint that you can engage with, and a different type of brand relationship. And that's a better conversation for us to have because that's when we're really starting to think about how do you take the brand and insert it into this in a meaningful way. So.
Okay, well, we're reaching the end of our time. Thank you very much. Hope we get to a day where we have a standardized metric and everybody knows what they're buying into, and I'm sure the foundation has been laid up here. Thanks for everybody joining us. I appreciate it.